11 hours, one bunker, 80 men. The numbers sit there like a problem with no solution, and for most of the night of November 7, 1942, on a small island most Americans couldn't find on a map, they weren't a problem. They were a reality. His name was Mitchell Red Cloud, Jr. He was 19 years old, a private first class from Hatfield, Wisconsin, population 312, a lumber town on the Black River where his father worked the mill. He had enlisted at 17, lying about his age to a recruiter who either didn't look closely at the birth certificate or didn't care. He was Ho-Chunk. His great-grandfather had been a warrior. He knew this. He had been told this. He was crouched inside a log and earth bunker on Guadalcanal, a rifle across his knees, listening. The jungle outside was not quiet. It was never quiet. But this was different. This was the sound of men moving in the dark, hundreds of them, trying not to sound like hundreds of them. The sound of equipment being adjusted, the sound of breath controlled by discipline. And then the charge came. What happened next would be documented in after-action reports, witness statements, and eventually a Medal of Honor citation signed by the Secretary of the Navy. What those documents describe is not a story about a man who is fearless. It is a story about a man who chose, in approximately the worst 11 hours of his life, to be something more than afraid. To understand what Red Cloud faced that night, and why the Japanese command chose this particular moment, this particular position, this particular tactic, we need to go back. Not just to the beginning of Guadalcanal, further than that, to the doctrine that put 80 men in a line and sent them running at a single fixed position in the dark. Doktrina, рожденная в поражении. The Japanese Imperial Army did not invent the banzai charge. They inherited it, refined it, and eventually made it their most recognizable tactical signature, and their most catastrophic one. But in November of 1942, it was not yet understood as catastrophic. It was understood as terrifying. The doctrine had roots in the Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868 when Japan dismantled its feudal military structure and began building a modern army almost from scratch. The men tasked with this transformation looked primarily at the Prussian model, specifically the army that had crushed France in 70 days in 1870 and 1871. They sent officers to study in Berlin. They hired German advisors. They absorbed everything: staff structure, logistics doctrine, officer training methodology. But they also kept something the Prussians hadn't given them: the samurai tradition of absolute commitment. The idea that death in battle was not a failure, but a consummation of purpose. The Bushido Code, formalized in the Meiji period, told a Japanese soldier that surrender was disgrace, retreat was cowardice, and death while attacking was the highest form of military honor. Hold that thought. The Japanese army tested itself for the first time in a major modern conflict in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. They won decisively. Then, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, they fought a European great power and won again at enormous cost. At Port Arthur, Japanese infantry charged Russian machine guns in daylight. They lost 20,000 men taking a single fortified hill. They took the hill. The lesson the Japanese officer corps drew from Port Arthur was not that frontal assault against prepared defenses was suicidal. The lesson they drew was that the spirit of the Japanese soldier, his willingness to die, was a force multiplier that could overcome any material disadvantage. Остановись и подумай об этом. 20,000 men, one hill, and the conclusion was, we should do this more. By 1937, when Japan invaded China, the doctrine of the all-out infantry assault had been formalized into something called Seishin Shugi, roughly, spirit doctrine. The idea was explicit. Japanese spiritual superiority would compensate for any firepower deficit. If your enemy had more guns, you charged faster. If your enemy had more artillery, you got close enough that his artillery couldn't target you without hitting his own men. If your enemy had prepared positions, you overwhelmed them with speed and aggression before his superior firepower could be brought fully to bear. In China, against a poorly equipped and often poorly led enemy, this worked often enough to reinforce the doctrine. Japanese infantry units developed a reputation, deserved, for terrifying aggression. They would attack at night, screaming, in mass formations, and the psychological shock alone would break defending units. The problem, and this was a problem the Japanese High Command refused to fully reckon with until very late in the war, was that Seishin Shugi was built on a battlefield that no longer existed. The doctrine assumed that spirit could compensate for firepower. But by 1942, American firepower had reached a point where that equation simply didn't balance. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese were about to run this experiment at full scale. Guadalcanal itself was not supposed to be contested terrain. When Japanese construction units began building an airfield on the island in July of 1942, they were operating in what the Imperial General Headquarters considered a secure rear area. The island was part of the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 900 miles from the major American base at Espiritu Santo. It was hot, malaria-ridden, covered in jungle, and of no particular strategic value except for one thing. It was flat enough to build an airfield. That airfield, which American forces would name Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, killed at the Battle of Midway, was the entire reason for what followed. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled air power over the Central Solomons. Whoever controlled air power over the Central Solomons could interdict Japanese supply lines to the south. The Japanese understood this. The Americans understood this. The island became, for 6 months, the most contested piece of ground in the Pacific. The 1st Marine Division landed on August 7, 1942, the first American offensive ground operation of the entire war. They took the airfield in 2 days. The Japanese garrison, mostly construction workers and a small security force, melted into the jungle. What followed was one of the strangest campaigns in modern military history. Both sides were simultaneously trying to reinforce the island and fighting a naval war in the surrounding waters. The Japanese called the nightly supply runs by destroyer the Tokyo Express. The Americans called the channel between Guadalcanal and Florida Island Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of ships sunk there. For 3 months, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. By November of 1942, the situation had stabilized enough that both sides understood the shape of the contest. The Marines held the airfield perimeter, a rough oval, maybe 3 miles wide and 4 miles long, ringed with bunkers, barbed wire, and interlocking fields of fire. Outside that perimeter was jungle, and in the jungle were Japanese soldiers. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, had approximately 22,000 men on Guadalcanal by this point. He had also received something unusual, a direct order from Imperial General Headquarters to take back Henderson Field before the end of November. This was not a suggestion. The Emperor's headquarters had decided that Guadalcanal was the decisive point of the entire Pacific campaign. Hyakutake was told to deliver the airfield. Hyakutake assigned the assault to Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama and the 2nd Division, one of the oldest and most decorated formations in the Japanese Army, the Sendai Division. Their regimental battle flags had been carried in every major Japanese conflict since the Russo-Japanese War. Maruyama's plan was, in its broad outlines, a reasonable one given the constraints. He would move his entire division, approximately 9,000 infantry, through 15 miles of trackless jungle to attack the southern face of the Marine perimeter, which was held more thinly than the northern face. The march would take days. The men would carry only what they could lift. There would be no artillery preparation. The attack would depend entirely on speed, darkness, and mass. The march became a catastrophe before the attack even began. The jungle was worse than any Japanese map had indicated. There were no trails. Men cut their way through with machetes. The heavy artillery, the guns that would have made the attack viable, had to be abandoned after a day. Soldiers who had started the march with 60 pounds of equipment were discarding everything they could. Men were dying of exhaustion and heat. The attack, originally scheduled for November 2nd, was postponed, then postponed again, and again. By the night of November 7th, Maruyama had managed to get approximately 3 regiments, roughly 3,000 men, into position on the south bank of the Matanakaw River, facing the Marine lines. They had no artillery. They had no air support. They had no coordination with the naval gunfire that was supposed to support them. What they had was the Sendai Division's reputation, their rifles, their bayonets, and the doctrine that had been built into them since their first day of training. They were going to charge. The perimeter and the man inside it. The Marine defensive line on the south face of the Guadalcanal perimeter was not a continuous trench. It was a series of strong points, bunkers, dugouts, cleared fields of fire, connected by wire and patrol routes. The terrain was rough. Ridge lines, creek beds, patches of jungle thick enough to hide a platoon at 10 yards. The Marines had been building and improving these positions for 3 months, but the line was still thin in places. There were gaps. Everyone knew there were gaps. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, held the sector where Mitchell Red Cloud's position was located. The battalion had been on Guadalcanal since the original landing in August. They were not fresh troops. 3 months of jungle, malaria, and intermittent combat had reduced the battalion's effective strength significantly. Official records from this period show rifle companies operating at 60 to 70% of authorized strength, with a significant portion of the men present for duty showing active malarial symptoms. Meet Private First Class Mitchell Red Cloud, Jr., 19 years old, from Hatfield, Wisconsin. He was Ho-Chunk, a member of the Winnebago Nation, whose ancestral territory covered much of what is now Wisconsin and Minnesota. His father had served in the First World War. His grandfather had been a warrior of the old kind. Red Cloud had grown up hearing these stories. He had enlisted in the Marines in 1941 at 17, before Pearl Harbor, before the war was a war that America was fighting. His recruiter, a staff sergeant at the Milwaukee recruiting station, had noted on the enlistment form that the applicant appeared young but was physically exceptional. He had been on Guadalcanal for 3 months. He had malaria. Almost every man on the island did. But it was in remission on November 7th. He was, by the accounts of the men who served with him, extremely quiet, not withdrawn, quiet in the way of someone who was paying attention. His position on the night of November 7th was a log bunker, approximately 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep, reinforced with sandbags on the forward face, with a firing aperture cut through the logs at roughly waist height when kneeling. The bunker was positioned on a slight rise, overlooking a creek bed that the Japanese would have to cross to reach the main Marine line. The field of fire was roughly 40 yards. Not much, but in jungle terrain 40 yards was a long way. He was not alone in the position. Standard practice was to man these bunkers with 3 to 4 men. But the exact composition of the position on that night is not fully documented in surviving records. What is documented is what happened when the attack came. The Japanese assault on the night of November 7, 1942, was part of the larger Maruyama offensive, the same offensive that had been delayed 5 times and had cost the Sendai Division a significant fraction of its fighting strength before a shot was fired. The regiment assigned to Red Cloud's sector was the 29th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Toshinaro Shoji. Shoji's men had completed the jungle march in worse condition than Maruyama had hoped. They were hungry. The jungle march had consumed most of their rations. They were exhausted. They were also, by every account, completely committed to the attack. The assault began at approximately 2100 hours. The standard Japanese night attack doctrine called for a silent approach to within 50 yards of the enemy position, followed by a sudden charge with bayonets fixed, screaming. The screaming was tactical, not emotional. It was designed to create panic, to disrupt the defender's ability to aim, to make the attacking mass seem larger and more terrifying than it was. Here is the detail that matters. The Japanese soldiers crossing that creek bed on the night of November 7th were not conscripts dragged into a hopeless charge. They were soldiers of the Sendai Division, a formation that had existed since 1800 and had fought in every major Japanese conflict. Their officers had graduated from the same military academy system that had produced the officers who won at Tsushima and at Mukden. They believed, with complete sincerity, in what they were doing. Udержи эту цифру. 80 men in the initial wave that reached Red Cloud's position. 80, against one bunker. Red Cloud opened fire. What the Marine Corps records describe is a sustained defensive action that lasted approximately 11 hours, from roughly 2100 on November 7th to approximately 0800 on November 8th. Red Cloud's .30 caliber Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, the standard squad automatic weapon, was the primary defensive weapon at his position. The BAR in 1942 fired at roughly 550 rounds per minute on automatic, fed from 20-round box magazines. Red Cloud would have carried approximately 10 to 12 magazines in his ammunition pouches, with additional ammunition in the bunker itself. He fired until the barrels got too hot. He reloaded. He fired again. The Japanese assault on his position came in waves. This was standard doctrine. If the first wave didn't break through, you sent the second wave. If the second wave failed, you sent the third. The logic was that the defenders would eventually exhaust their ammunition, their will, or both. Against a single machine gun position with limited ammunition, this logic was often correct. What the records indicate is that Red Cloud's position held through at least 3 distinct assault waves. The creek bed in front of his bunker, a shallow crossing roughly 2 feet deep and 6 feet wide, became the killing ground. The Japanese had to cross it. Red Cloud was firing from a prepared position at men who were moving, in the dark, across open ground. Самая жестокая ирония. Вот в чем. The doctrine that had sent those men across the creek, Seishin Shugi, spirit over firepower, had been built on the assumption that the attacker's will could overcome the defender's material advantage. But the material advantage of a prepared defensive position with interlocking fields of fire is not primarily about the number of guns. It is about the fact that the defender knows exactly where the attacker has to go. Red Cloud knew where the creek was. He knew the crossing point. He had been looking at it for 3 months. Sometime during the night, the exact time is not recorded, Red Cloud was wounded. The wound was significant enough that it appears in both the Medal of Honor citation and in subsequent medical records. A Japanese rifle round hit him in the chest. Not a grazing wound, a serious wound. He did not stop firing. The Marines in adjacent positions could hear his BAR throughout the night. This is documented in multiple witness statements collected after the battle. They could hear it because it was the sound of their flank being held. If Red Cloud's position fell, the Japanese would have a breach in the line. Through that breach, they could roll up the entire defensive position from the south. Henderson Field, the airfield, the entire reason for the campaign, would be in direct danger. He knew this. Every man on the line knew this. Вот криминалистический факт, который проходит через все свидетельства. Through 11 hours of darkness, against at least 3 assault waves, with a chest wound, Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. did not leave his position. Часть третья. The night and what it cost. By 0300 on November 8th, the Japanese assault on the marine perimeter had been broken in most sectors. Maruyama's plan had failed for the same reasons that most of his plans on Guadalcanal had failed. The jungle had degraded his force before contact, his coordination had collapsed in the darkness, and the Marines had held. But in Red Cloud's sector, the fighting was not over. The creek bed in front of his bunker had become, by the early morning hours, a scene of extraordinary violence. The Japanese assault waves had not achieved a breakthrough, but they had not stopped coming. Shoji's regiment was operating on the assumption that if they pushed hard enough at a single point, something would give. This was not unreasonable. At some point, ammunition runs out. At some point, men break. The mathematics of attrition usually favor the attacker who is willing to spend enough. What the Japanese command did not account for, could not account for because it was not a variable in their doctrine, was the specific human being in that specific bunker. The Marine Corps after-action report for this engagement, filed by the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, records that Red Cloud's position accounted for approximately 35 confirmed enemy dead in the immediate area of the bunker. The actual number of casualties his fire inflicted during the 11-hour engagement was higher. The 35 figure reflects bodies found within the bunker's immediate field of fire after the battle. Wounded who crawled away, men killed further back by his fire on the approach, were not included in that count. А теперь самое важное. The significance of Red Cloud's action was not primarily numerical. It was positional. His bunker was the anchor point of a 300-yard section of the Marine line. If that anchor failed, the men to his left and right would have had their flanks exposed. A Japanese breakthrough at that point would not have produced a local tactical success. It would have produced a crisis along the entire southern face of the perimeter. Meet Corporal James Whitaker, 23 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, a former grocery store stockroom clerk who had enlisted in the Marines in March of 1941. Whitaker was in the adjacent position, approximately 40 yards to Red Cloud's left. His account, given to Marine Corps historians in 1946, is one of the primary sources for what happened that night. I could hear his BAR all night, Whitaker said. There was never more than maybe a minute between bursts. I knew as long as I could hear it, that flank was held. When it went quiet for a few minutes around dawn, I thought he was gone. Then it started again. What Whitaker describes is a man making a decision, repeatedly, over 11 hours. Every time Red Cloud reloaded, 20 rounds in the magazine, roughly 2 to 3 seconds of sustained fire at the BAR's cyclic rate, he was making a decision. Every time a Japanese soldier crossed into his field of fire and he pulled the trigger, he was making a decision. Every time the pain from his chest wound became acute enough to affect his breathing, and he kept firing anyway, he was making a decision. The final assault on his position came at approximately 0700 on November 8th. By this point, Shoji's regiment had suffered severe casualties, and the assault had lost its momentum in most sectors. But a final group, the accounts vary between 20 and 30 men, made one more push at Red Cloud's position. He was out of BAR magazines. What the Medal of Honor citation describes at this point is Red Cloud fighting with his rifle, his M1 Garand, and, in the final moments, with his bayonet fixed, having wrapped his arm around a post to support himself because the chest wound had made it difficult to stand unassisted. He was 19 years old. He had been fighting for 11 hours. He had a bullet in his chest. He fixed his bayonet and kept fighting. The position held. Перечитай эту строчку еще раз. The position held. When Marine units swept through the sector at 0800 on November 8th, They found Red Cloud still at his post. He was alive. Barely. He was evacuated to the field hospital at Henderson Field, where the medical staff who treated him noted in the medical record that his wounds were critical, consistent with prolonged activity after initial injury. He survived Guadalcanal. He was evacuated to a hospital in the United States, recovered, and here is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about this particular man: re-enlisted. He went back to the Pacific. He was at Guam. He was at the Philippines. He was at Okinawa. He accumulated a combat record that spanned 4 major Pacific campaigns. The Medal of Honor he had earned at Guadalcanal was recommended by his battalion commander in late November of 1942. It moved through the recommendation process, was reviewed, was verified against multiple witness statements, and was finally approved in 1943. The citation read, in part, that Red Cloud, by his outstanding valor and courageous initiative, and with utter disregard for his own personal safety, contributed materially to the success of the engagement and the protection of the entire battalion. Contributed materially, military bureaucratic language for he held the line. Часть 4. Вердикт. Вот криминалистический вердикт этого расследования. The Japanese assault on the night of November 7, 1942, was not a poorly conceived plan executed by incompetent commanders. It was a well-designed plan executed by experienced commanders who were operating within a doctrine that had been built on a false premise. The false premise was this: that spiritual commitment is a force multiplier sufficient to compensate for material disadvantage. This premise had worked before. It had worked at Port Arthur in 1905, where Japanese infantry had crossed open ground into Russian machine gun fire and kept going until the position fell. It had worked in Manchuria in 1931 and in China from 1937 onward, where the enemy's firepower was comparable or inferior to Japan's own. The doctrine had been validated by battlefield results often enough that the Japanese officer corps had built an entire military culture around it. What it could not survive was a prepared defensive position, interlocking fields of fire, and a single Marine with a Browning automatic rifle who had decided he was not leaving. Maruyama's offensive, the larger operation of which the assault on Red Cloud's position was a part, failed completely. The Sendai Division suffered approximately 1,500 killed in the November 7th and 8th fighting alone, against a Marine perimeter that held everywhere except for a brief and quickly sealed penetration on the eastern sector. Japanese forces never came close to Henderson Field. By February of 1943, the Japanese High Command had evacuated the last of their forces from Guadalcanal, a nighttime operation they called Ka, that successfully extracted approximately 13,000 men but left behind the island, the airfield, and the strategic initiative in the South Pacific. Остановись и подумай об этом. 1,500 Japanese soldiers killed in 2 nights of fighting, against a defensive perimeter held by men who had been on the island for 3 months, who were sick with malaria, who were operating at 60 to 70% strength. The doctrine of Seishin Shugi produced a casualty ratio that no army could sustain. The myth that has grown up around Guadalcanal, and around actions like Red Cloud's specifically, is that it was a story about American toughness defeating Japanese fanaticism. This framing is wrong in 2 directions simultaneously. The Japanese soldiers who charged that creek bed were not fanatics in any meaningful sense of the word. They were professional soldiers operating within a military doctrine that their entire training had told them was correct. They had seen it work. They believed it. The courage required to cross an open killing ground at night against a prepared position, knowing the odds, is not fanaticism. It is something harder to dismiss than fanaticism. It is conviction. And Red Cloud was not simply tough. Toughness is a word we use when we want to admire something without having to think about it too carefully. What Red Cloud demonstrated over 11 hours was something more specific. the ability to make the same decision repeatedly under conditions of extreme pain and mortal danger for as long as the decision needed to be made. The distinction matters because it tells us something about what actually happened in that bunker. There is a question that the after-action reports don't answer, because it's not the kind of question after-action reports ask. What was Red Cloud thinking during those 11 hours? We don't know. We can't know. He left no memoir. The interviews he gave after the war were brief and characteristically spare. He was not a man who used more words than were necessary. What we know is what he did. And what he did was hold a position for 11 hours, wounded, until the assault was broken. The Medal of Honor citation says he contributed materially to the success of the engagement. This is accurate. It is also one of the most significant understatements in the documented history of Pacific combat. Here is what contributed materially actually means when you trace the causal chain. Red Cloud's position was the anchor of a 300-yard section of line. That section of line was the southern face of the Henderson Field perimeter. Henderson Field was the reason for the entire Guadalcanal campaign. If the southern face had been breached, if Red Cloud's position had fallen in the first or second assault wave, as it should have by any reasonable calculation, the Marines would have faced a crisis requiring the commitment of reserves that were already at minimum strength, against a Japanese force that had more men and was prepared to spend them. The chain does not guarantee that a breach at Red Cloud's position would have produced the fall of Henderson Field. War is not deterministic, but it was a genuine possibility, and a 19-year-old private first class from Hatfield, Wisconsin, with a bullet in his chest and a BAR in his hands, made it not happen. Сосчитайте сам. 3 months on a malaria-ridden island, 60 to 70% effective strength, 11 hours, 3 assault waves, 1 chest wound, 35 confirmed dead in the immediate field of fire, 1 position held. The biographical arc of Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. after Guadalcanal has a particular shape. He recovered from his wounds. He went back to the Pacific. He finished the war. He returned to Hatfield, Wisconsin, population 312, and the town that had sent him to war was the town he came home to. He received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the Marine Corps base Quantico in 1943, presented by a Marine general who, by his own account, had difficulty finding words adequate to the citation he was reading. Red Cloud lived until 1950. He died on November 5th, 1950, at the age of 27, in Korea. A different war, a different jungle, a different night. He was killed in action near Chonghyon, Korea, holding a position against a Chinese assault while his company withdrew. The details of his death are documented in a second Medal of Honor recommendation, which was approved posthumously. He is one of 19 men in American military history to have been awarded the Medal of Honor twice. Перечитай эту строчку еще раз. He is one of 19 men in American military history to have been awarded the Medal of Honor twice. He was 27 years old when he died. He had been in combat for 9 years of his 27, across 5 campaigns on 3 islands and a peninsula. He is buried at the Ho Chunk Veterans Cemetery in Winnebago County, Wisconsin, in the territory of the people he came from. И вот что упустили все. The conventional narrative of Guadalcanal focuses on the strategic level. The naval battles, the air campaigns, the supply crisis, the decision by Imperial General Headquarters to commit and then withdraw. These things matter. They shaped the campaign. But the strategic outcome of Guadalcanal was not decided by admirals in flag bridges or generals in command posts. It was decided, incrementally, by individual acts of resistance at individual positions along a 3-mile perimeter. The night of November 7, 1942, was one of those acts. 1 bunker, 1 man, 11 hours. The doctrine of Seishin Shugi, spirit over firepower, had a built-in answer to the problem of a single determined defender. The answer was, send more men. Keep sending them. Eventually, the defender will break. It was a doctrine that had worked before against defenders who broke. It did not have an answer for a 19-year-old from Hatfield, Wisconsin, who had decided he was not going to break. And that, in the end, is what this investigation finds. Not that one man won the Battle of Guadalcanal. Not that individual heroism defeats institutional doctrine. The finding is more precise than that. The finding is that doctrine, any doctrine, is a system built on assumptions about how human beings will behave under maximum pressure. The assumption built into Seishin Shugi was that defenders, faced with sufficient mass and aggression, will eventually choose survival over resistance. Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. did not make that choice. He held the bunker for 11 hours. He held it wounded. He held it until the assault was broken. And then, 7 years later, on a different hill, in a different war, he held a different position for long enough that the men behind him could get clear. 11 hours, 1 bunker, 80 men. The numbers sit there like a problem with no solution. Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. solved it the only way it could be solved, by deciding 11 hours in a row that the position was worth holding. If this investigation gave you something you didn't have before, a clearer picture of what that night on Guadalcanal actually looked like, not the version that fits in a citation or a summary, but the version that lasted 11 hours in a log bunker on a creek bank, while the doctrine of an empire broke itself against one man's refusal, press-like. It keeps this story visible a little longer, and it deserves to stay visible. He was 19 years old. He was Ho Chunk. He was a Marine. He held the line.